Lea Ypi, as most of you will know, is professor in political theory in the government department of the London School of Economics and Political Science. She has a PhD from the European University Institute in Florence, was a prize fellow at Nuffield College, Oxford University. She is the author of Global Justice and Avant-Garde Political Agency, 2011, and of The Meaning of Partisanship, co-authored with her husband, Jonathan White. She is co-editor of a book which is important for our topic today, Migration in Political Theory with Sarah Fine, The Ethics of Movement and Membership, which came out in 2019, and a new book entitled Free, in the new genre of auto-theory, will come out with Penguin later this year and come out in a German translation. I presume that it will be called Frei in German, with Surkamp next year. Lea is a regular visitor to these shores, as most of you will know, for example, at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin, where she, I believe, would have been had the conference actually taken place when it should have taken place last year, but because it was postponed, she is now videoed in at the Normative Orders Cluster in Frankfurt, and as I was very happy to hear, soon at the new institute in Hamburg. Lea, very welcome to the virtual Dresden, to our virtual conference. The floor is yours for your presentation.
Great, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you for this invitation. It's nice to see you all. So my paper is called Solidarity, Immigration and Social Class, and talks about a progressive dilemma about skepticism around immigration, which is not rooted in racism or scaremongering about the threat to liberal culture, like the kind of conservative arguments that are skeptic around immigration, but I think is no less troubling. And it takes both a pragmatic and a principled version. The pragmatic version of the argument has to do with strategic necessity and electoral constraints faced by left-wing political movements who feel the pressure by right-wing forces on the electoral scene to make anti-immigration arguments in hope that they will appeal to a broader public and get more votes and so on. That's not really my concern in this paper. Here I'm interested in a kind of principled position, which is what has also been labeled in the literature on immigration as the progressive dilemma. And that is the alleged trade-off between immigration openness and support for the welfare state due to the twin pressures of cultural conflicts, it's often said, but also distributive conflicts. So sometimes we hear that from a distributive perspective, migration increases pressures for jobs or access to healthcare, social housing, and so on. And from a cultural perspective, we're told that large-scale immigration brings cultural divisions that undermine the kind of trust and solidarity that one hopes one finds in the welfare state. And we know that the empirical evidence around both of these claims is inconclusive, but that doesn't really stop people from making these arguments anyway. And then once they're made, they acquire a kind of performative function. It doesn't really matter what the scientific basis around them is, because the ideology around immigration is disturbing, and it disturbs how we understand solidarity and to whom we can extend solidarity in our political communities. And the response to the dilemma so far has been to take seriously the nation-state model of solidarity that is at the core of these discussions around immigration, and to extend and to try and incorporate the kind of challenge, the progressive dilemma, so as to adapt that model to the circumstances of contemporary politics. And so the two most prominent arguments that one finds around that is what one might call multicultural model of solidarity and a supra-national model of solidarity, which will be my main targets in this paper, and in alternative to which I want to suggest an alternative way of thinking about solidarity, which I'm going to call, for want of a better term, class-based solidarity. And what my model, or at least the class-based model of solidarity, does is not so much to extend or to complement or to internally modify these other two models, but to really offer an alternative to them. And again, not an alternative as an institutional arrangement, but more as an alternative way of thinking about immigration. So I'm just going to talk quickly about what I think are the shortcomings of these two models, and then say something around how I see the class-based model and what the advantages of thinking around solidarity along class-based lines are. So the main problem, as I see it from these alternatives, is that instead of challenging the nation-state model of solidarity, they either try to extend it or to render it more internally diverse. But both rely on a kind of ideal of cooperation that is rooted in this traditional combination of territory, sovereignty, and population. And both of these models reflect the distribution of obligations in a political community between members of this territorially defined unit. And both suggest that under democratic conditions, the struggle of creating political institutions creates forms of decision-making and collective attachment that take a kind of civic national form. And civic nationalism usually relies on these twin ideas of popular sovereignty on the one hand and civic education on the other. And what the multicultural and supranational models of solidarity do is to try and extend civic nationalism by developing alternatives which try and preserve the benefits of the dominant civic national model on which we rely, but reject its limitations. And so, for example, the multicultural model would say the aspiration is to try and reject the idea of solidarity based on shared culture and to develop a sense of multicultural belonging that is sensitive to the diversity of ethnic groups present in the territory, often through migratory fluxes. And so the idea is to turn the nation building project into a multicultural nation building project. And the supranational model, similarly, the aspiration is to reject this kind of unified homogenic national solidarity in favor of the construction of larger supranational units that are better able to respond to the challenges of globalization. Think about the European Union, for example. So what I want to suggest is that in developing these alternative proposals, both the multicultural and the supranational model don't really challenge the kind of idea of solidarity that is based on political culture. And instead what they do is to kind of revise the concept of political membership that is at the heart of the nation state, but while generating these alternative forms of attachment. My worry, though, is that neither of them really challenges the idea of obligations of social justice that apply only between the members of these cooperative units, let's call them. And so the compliance and the kind of special obligations of membership that these new cooperative schemes generate continues to be central to both the multicultural and the supranational model. So just to say something briefly around what I think is problematic there, the nation-state model is based on an appeal to, shared language, history, political tradition. And the multicultural model does more or less the same thing, except it says we need more languages, more cultures, more political traditions. And the supranational model says similarly that we need more languages, more cultures, and we also need to extend the decision-making mechanisms and to expand them territorially. But I think both of them neglect and generate their own forms of exclusion. And of course, in the case of, and these are familiar objections to these models. So in the case of the multicultural model, for example, the idea is that only social groups that are represented in the recognized political cultures of a political community count. And in the case of supranational institutions, this takes the form of recognizing obligations and generating rights and duties that only apply between the members of those cooperative schemes. And so think about the example of European freedom of movement, which is recognized between member states, but severely restricted and in fact harshly policed when the claim is made from the outside. And this gives cases for reflection. So the concern is that with both of these accounts of solidarity, these alternatives to solidarity, they rely on an ideal of social cooperation that I think is insensitive to the asymmetries of wealth or power or discursive resources that characterize relationships between citizens of the same state or across different states, and that still exclude others. And so these models are based both on a kind of narrative of the emergence of social solidarity that would have been the case if the obligations had been the result of cooperation, but that has actually rarely historically been the case. So the problem is that, as I see it, the liberal democratic state has neither been liberal, particularly liberal, or with the exception of few historical moments, particularly democratic, with regard to all those subjected to the power of its institutions. the fact that it has, I think, historically consolidated in parallel to the development of capitalism and to the expansion of global market structures means that the state's internal legal and political structure and also the juridical form of cooperation between these members reflects and entrenches these asymmetries of property distribution or hierarchies of power and wealth, which have characterized the creation of global international order. So the liberal democratic states has not been the site of cooperation, it has rather been the site of struggle. And in this struggle, the ideas of nation, of compliance with shared norms or collective attachments has been instrumental to the consolidation of elite projects of subordinating vulnerable minorities. So I think when we think about the progressive dilemma around immigration and about the models that we offer as alternatives to it, we need to think and take the liberal democratic state as it is, not as we would like it to be. And this means thinking outside the idealizations and inaccuracies of the multicultural and supranational models, and also outside their reification of this ideal of political cooperation, which is in tension with the historical reality of the political communities that we have. And I think the alternative model with which we need to proceed, and which I think is more nuanced and also possibly more historically sensitive to how solidarity really emerges, is not to see solidarity as the emergence and consolidation of universal processes of social recognition in the nation or in the political community, but as the development of resources for joint action by people who are subjected to unjust power relations that may or may not take a territorially bounded form, and in fact often don't take a territorially bounded form. So we need to be able to think about solidarity as emerging from the shared action of people who have experienced or who identify with people who have experienced a condition of shared oppression. So I think a more historically nuanced account of the political process of developing solidarity out of this shared condition of oppression would show us that solidarity is not grounded on a particular ethic of political membership, but on a politically coordinated effort to develop the joint political resources for overcoming this shared condition of oppression. So now, sometimes people who defend the multicultural and the supranational model, they concede that the reality of the construction of solidarity has often not been the one that goes along the lines of, developing civic education or developing these shared cultural allegiances that are also bound by political norms and so on. They concede that solidarity is often the effort of building social and political movements that are able to successfully organize and mobilize. But I think they don't really see how much actually these two different models, the class-based one and the supranational and multicultural one, really point to different conceptions of how political action emerges and what resources for joint political action there are when we're confronted with problems like migration. And so, and the idea is that in this alternative class-based explanation, that alternative is grounded not on the shared loyalty of the different members of a political community, but to a different type of solidarity that runs along lines of social class. And let me say something about why I, in trying to now sketch as a final part of the paper, the idea of class solidarity, let me say why I don't think that the reconciliation of the class-based model with these two other models that I've been discussing is as straightforward as people present it. And I think what the problem is that these models are in tension because the ideas of political community on which they are based are actually very different ideas. So one is a cooperative one. In the case of the multicultural and the supranational models, the political community is understood as a system of cooperation where these legal and political obligations distribute obligations of social justice, more broadly speaking, and where shared cultural practices make these obligations sustainable in the long term. That's the story, at least. And in the other one, in the class-based model, the political community is rather a site of conflict between groups which have different power relations that result from their different positioning in the particular social, legal, and economic processes that have characterized the emergence of the global order. And so on this account, on my account at least, classes are neither pre-existent social groups that are exclusively determined by particularly economic processes, as in the sort of standard materialist explanation, but nor are they completely contingent aggregates of social opportunities. I think social classes result from processes of what some sociologists call class structuration that are shaped by these asymmetries of ownership and social power, and by the influence of political, juridical, economic, and ideological factors that regulate relationships between groups in a global market. So let me now say why this matters, how we understand the site of conflict and how we understand the cleavages around conflict for questions of immigration, and for the progressive dilemma with which I started. And my contention is that most of the existing literature on political membership and on why immigration is a problem begins by taking for granted this nation-state model of solidarity, and by also focusing around these alternatives that I have just sketched, and therefore also analyzes the problem of migration as a problem of political membership. So in the dominant models, migration is a problem because the asymmetries and inequalities that shape the international sphere, where you have differences between different states and between the citizens of different states, have all to do with factors that have to do with political membership. And that's to say, a state's level of development, the system of rights and obligations that membership makes available, and so on. Now, in the class-based model, migration isn't a problem as such. It's only a problem in the context of a global process of production and distribution of goods that is shaped by the circulation of capital and by the distinctive national and global juridical and political relations that enable this reproduction. And so under this class-based model, the asymmetries of power and wealth that globalization under capitalism generates produces social conflicts both in developed and in developing states. But the way in which different classes of people are affected by these conflicts in these countries is also different. And so what that means is that poor citizens of rich countries and poor citizens of poor countries are going to be adversely affected by similar phenomena of deindustrialization, digitalization, productivity crisis, regardless where they are, even if it doesn't mean that they are affected in the same way. And so even if more local factors are relevant in how the state copes with these pressures, the pressures are going to be the same, pressures of globalization. And likewise, rich citizens of rich countries and rich citizens of poor countries will benefit from the advantages that ruling elites can extract from the state, even if there is a lot of variation depending on how effective democratic channels are in these countries, in the way in which distinctive legal and political orders shape the balance of power between social classes. So in all these cases, the strength of the organization of internal domestic movements, both internationally and internationally, so intranationally and internationally, affects the distribution of power relationship between the state. So let me just, in the last 3 or 4 minutes that I have left, sketch out quickly what the implications of these different ways of thinking about solidarity are when it comes to reflecting on migration related problems. So on the multicultural and the supranational model, an immigrant worker and a domestic worker are distinguished by their membership in different political communities. And the relevant social movements and political forces that represent domestic workers, it's often said, have a stronger obligation to cater to them than they have to immigrant workers because of the allegiance to shared political community, which takes priority in how we discharge these obligations. On the class-based model, agents who defend the concerns of workers have no principled reason to prioritize workers who shared political membership vis-a-vis immigrant workers. Because since the analysis and interpretation of what counts as global political conflicts is global, and since the asymmetries of power that are conducive to this global process of circulation of capital are what is considered to be responsible for migration tensions, the response to the conflict should also be global. So this is why I think the fact that many of the progressive political movements in liberal democratic societies are reluctant to mobilize on behalf of foreign workers and that they also struggle to involve them in their campaigns isn't just explained on social and strategic grounds. What is a problem, I think, is the kind of overall social structure and the system of economic incentives and the competitive political environment in which they operate, which is in addition to the models of political community along the lines of which we think we should discharge our obligations of social justice. And of course, the implications of that model are that, you know, trade unions are organized on a national basis, that the barriers of mobilization on vulnerable immigrants, for example, are extremely high, and that progressive parties and social movements can only mobilize successfully if they shape public policies that advantage workers. And they can only shape these policies if they win elections, but to win elections, they need to appeal to a constituency of citizens where, from a purely legal perspective, divisions of class are irrelevant, but political membership is crucial. And so if those structural constraints were not in place, and if we weren't thinking about solidarity, or if progressive political movements weren't thinking about solidarity along those political membership lines, then I think the principled case for showing more concern for domestic workers wouldn't stand up to critical scrutiny. And so this is why prioritizing social justice obligations within political communities and distinguishing between foreign and domestic foreign and domestic workers along cultural and political membership lines seems to undermine the kind of cause of workers from a more general perspective. So just to really wrap up, I think what I'm trying to say here is that to understand the question of justice in immigration more broadly, and to understand it in a way that places it in the context of a more general analysis of global injustice, I think we need to think about political conflicts not as conflicts between states and groups with different cultural profiles, but as conflicts between membership of different political classes. And so I think this is one of the main ways in which an alternative way of thinking in political theory, which is conducive, goes back to Marx, departs from previous Enlightenment, for example, thinking where the relevant collective agents in world history were thought to be nations and states, and where with this alternative tradition developing, the relevant collective agents become social classes. And I think it's also the main reason for why this class-based model of solidarity differs from the liberal account based on political membership, and which I think pervades the multicultural and the supranational model too. And the problem, I think, and the reason why that kind of membership model is not well equipped to fix international and global asymmetries of power is that it emphasizes contractual agreements instead of power relationships. It emphasizes cooperation rather than conflict, and it doesn't look at the development of kind of global commercial society without reducing those conflicts and without interpreting the main protagonists in that scheme by thinking about the political membership and by thinking about just the agency of the states. So what is important in the alternative model is that class conflicts cut across state boundaries. And so an analysis of politics that focuses on class rather than political and cultural identities would then inform an alternative analysis of the state, which would, I think, lead to also an alternative interpretation of the different social roles that are played by different political and economic elites in a global system of capitalist exploitation. So basically, the problem with the progressive dilemma and the reason why the models of solidarity that accompany it are inadequate is that they reduce social conflicts to conflicts between states and their citizens that are defined along cultural and political lines. And so the model creates a kind of we of domestic workers with certain rights and benefits that must be protected, and a kind of them of foreign workers that must be controlled. And so the division between foreign and domestic workers is a kind of narrower application of that larger division, which reifies identities based on culture and political identity and undermines, I think, the alternative way of understanding conflict and also interpreting this kind of joint struggle of workers internationally. So I think I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Lea, for this alternative picture of the sources of solidarity and the redevelopment of a class-based perspective. We unfortunately do not have an applause feature in this webinar, which I think is a lacuna. So we have to wait for the discussion to get any feedback to your talk. And there are a number of ways to participate in the subsequent Q&A session. One of them is just to raise your yellow hand. Another is to either type in that you would like to contribute or to type in your actual question in the FNA or in the chat format. But we'll start by looking at the hands that have been raised already. And there's Janet Ehrmann with the first question. Now, the custom is that the people who ask questions decide whether they switch on their video screen. Jeanette is now present. Can you unmute yourself, Jeanette, and ask your first question?
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much, Lea Ypi, for this wonderful presentation, also very thought-provoking. I share with you the skepticism on the language of multiculturalism, and at the same time, I wonder if migration is maybe a concept too narrow, and if we should also take into consideration the intersectionality of class with race. And I'm thinking here of Du Bois's notion of the wages of whiteness, of the Black Marxist discussion of racial capitalism, and of Stuart Hall's notion of race as the central modality in which class is lived. And what we see in the contemporary moment is that race is erased as a constitutive mode of class, and at the same time it's exploited as a central strategy to make a decision between what Robbie Shilliam calls a distinction between the deserving and the undeserving poor. So I would appreciate more clarification on how you would theorize the intersectionality of class with race in your class-based model of solidarity.
Thank you, Jeanette. Lea, can you take up the question directly?
Yes. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That's very important, and it's very helpful. And I've been presenting this paper for a while now, and I keep thinking and saying I need to go back and do the work on intersectionality properly. But I have been recently reading the work of people like Cedric Robinson, for example, on the development of racial capitalism. And I think there is certainly a whole strand in Black thinking, which is eminently compatible with the kind of analysis that I have been offering here, which is precisely around how this process of class structuration within the emergence of global capitalism have also been riding on other ways of generating exclusion, which were not just, primarily the traditional standard one, which is about workers and capitalists, but which has also been parasitic on, for example, gender divisions and domestic labor, or racial divisions and the emergence of sort of labor, the exploited labor of Black people in the colonies. And so it kind of integrates the emergence of colonialism with the development of capitalism in core hegemonic liberal states. So I think I haven't said a lot in the paper around that particular question, but I think it's a very good question, and one that is, I think, eminently compatible with this framework. It's not one that requires you to change the framework. It's one that rather requires you to kind of delve into these alternative ways of thinking, which I think is also extremely important because it gets us away, precisely as you said, I think, from the instrumentalization of race in isolation from a number of the contemporary problems that we face, which have to do with the development of the nature of capitalism. So, yeah.
Thanks for this first response. Very briefly, I now have 4 questions on the table. The first will be by Floris Biskamp, then we have Marta Kozlowska, then Bernd Ladwig, and then Andreas Oldenburg. Floris, you're next.
Okay, thanks. And thank you very much for the talk. I think I agree with about everything except for the very important empirical step of your class analysis, because it seems to me that you made this, obviously in this context, very crude point about globalization and how it affects the rich people in different countries and the worse off people in different countries. But I think if you zoom in a little bit, it gets much trickier, and it's, I think, a very hard case to make that a worker in a German automobile industry with collective bargaining contracts has some sort of class interest that relates even to a worker in a less organized industry in Germany, or to domestic workers in Germany, let alone to someone who's worse off in another country. And I think the logic or the problem behind all this is that the class structure in today's global political economy is to a large degree shaped by national differences, because it's the whole institutional setup in which global political economy works. And I think if you do a more differentiated class analysis, then you'll find classes that align quite well with national borders. And I think then your whole argument about thinking of class solidarity rather than national solidarity is weakened quite a bit, I think. And I just would ask you to convince me that I'm wrong and you're right, which I hope.
Okay. Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. Let me just get my notes up. So I think, well, there is a bit of a chicken and egg problem here, I think. And I think the reality maybe is in between. I think I was, for rhetorical and for purposes of pushing back against this model that I was starting with, I was emphasizing the centrality of class membership at the expense of political membership. I think you're right to say that empirically, obviously political membership matters a lot with regard to how particular social classes are able to take or not take advantage of political structures and also of the legal and the social system. So this all matters. However, I think it's, and so I think what we have to think about when we think about, where is the truth here, is what is the relationship between the development of nation-based, for example, collective bargaining, ability to have left-wing movements and political parties that can campaign and drive advantages forward for particular social constituencies, and the pressures of global capital. Now, I think if you think about the recent political science, I mean, I'm not a political scientist, there's sort of ways in which this discussion in political science has parallels with the ways in which global justice has been discussed in liberal political theory, or even sort of egalitarian political theory in the last few years with regard to how we think about the distribution of social justice obligations. But if we just stick to the political science analysis for a while, I think it has become clear in the last few years through the work of people like Peter Mayer or my colleague at LSE, Jonathan Hopkin, and so on, that the ability to use social opportunities and to take advantage of legal rights within particular domestic states, even in the advanced capitalist countries like Germany and so on, very much depends on the pressures of global capital. So if the global political economy goes down, then your ability to mobilize, to take advantage of collective bargaining, the class system, the relationship between the kind of class system and the political voice of these movements also is in crisis. And we see this because we see that the left-wing political parties have been vulnerable to these pressures from, globalization for the last 20, 30 years, which means that their ability to represent these traditionally core constituencies has also declined, which means that, in general, they're also having a crisis. And that means that then the whole collective bargaining system is underlined, which I think is not to say that I think you're right, that empirically it matters a lot that you're in a country where you have, for example, bargaining advantages and so on. But I think the broader picture with which you start makes a difference even to the ability of these parties or these social movements to take advantage of the legal system or to kind of hold on to certain privileges or to push back against certain ruling elites and so on. So I think it seems to me that empirically now there is a kind of consensus around the fact that the financial crisis of 2008 has made a huge difference to the ability of domestic political actors to gain advantage or to represent traditionally kind of domestic working classes. And that goes to, I think, speaks to the fact that these pressures around the national political economies are very much also driven by the development of global capital. And so when things go well, when this is, when depending on where it booms and busts, so when you're in a moment of capital accumulation, of social technological innovation and so on, then there is more to distribute. When there's less to distribute, political conflict becomes heightened. And my worry is that with the models that we have, we are unable to see that because our models all focus on the state as a site of solidarity and cooperation. And, we always think empirically, yes, there is this history of injustice and so on, but somehow we now have this magic thing called democracy and we are able to, take advantage of this. And what I'm trying to put pressure on is the fact that even if that were the case, this is not a given and it's not something that doesn't change depending on what kind of analysis you have and what model you start with. And so what I'm trying to do with with this account is to say, look, if you think about solidarity as a process that is driven by conflict rather than by cooperation between different social groups, then you will also have a different analysis for how to incorporate the claims of these different social groups. But point taken that, you know, in the way in which I presented this, there was a sharp, obviously, I was trying to, just to get my critique out clearly, I obviously didn't put as much emphasis on these differences of degree and nuance, but I think you're right. It's obviously clear that, you know, whether you're a worker in Albania and a worker in Germany and a worker in Ghana, this makes a huge difference to, you know, your condition as worker. But I think the sort of general theoretical analysis is one that, if you're thinking about oppression along these global lines, and if you think about the pressures of political economy, then that will, the category of the type of oppression will be similar, even if the degrees are not the same.
Thanks, Lea. May I now read out the question by Marta Kozlowska, which fits in quite well here. She asks you to clarify how you define or understand solidarity in this paper.
Thank you. So I use an account of solidarity, which is the kind of account of solidarity that I've been working with throughout my previous work, which wasn't necessarily about social classes and so on. But I think of solidarity as a kind of political resource, and a kind of political resource that emerges out of shared oppression. So it's solidarity for me, it's a kind of condition that requires shared oppression or shared injustice, and it's a resource that groups or individuals find within their efforts to fight for justice or to fight against that injustice, basically. So I think it's a kind of, I guess, you know, some people call it, well, anyway, don't need labels. Basically, I think of solidarity as a political resource that emerges out of shared oppression.
Thanks, Lea. Now, could we have Bernd Ladwig as a videoed in speaker now? Ah, it's working. Hi, Bernd. We can't see you yet.
So, just a second.
This looks good, and we hear you.
Can you see me now? Hello, Peter. Hello, Lea. Thank you very much for your talk. I like it a lot, and especially what I like is your focus on conflict and on power relations, as opposed to a more harmonized picture of contract relations, common belonging, and so forth. But on the other hand, I think even if you have such a focus on conflict and power relations, you could also make a point in favor of a citizenship model. And this has to do with something that in a way is a follow-up to the remarks of Loris Biskamp. Citizenship, I think, is a status which is especially valuable in many regards for the more disadvantaged classes and groups in a society. For it contains a lot of achievements that are the results of former struggles of the working classes and other disadvantaged groups. And that not only contains material benefits, social rights, but also accountability, democratic rights. And you have no equivalence, at least no direct equivalence for all these achievements on the level of social and transnational movements. But if you focus on the institutionalization of social achievements, you are already at the level of the particular nation states. And that, of course, poses a problem of particularity in contrast to universalist claims. So I just want you to say a few more words about this kind of tension. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I think you're right to say that that citizenship understood in this kind of legal, I would say purely legal way, does entrench particular advantages and does sort of give excluded groups material benefits and also recognition of social rights and so on. So I don't necessarily have a problem, I guess, with citizenship in general, but I do have a problem with the contingent understanding of citizenship as connected to liberalism and to capitalist liberalism more specifically. And so what I'm not so sure about is the ability to keep these gains firm, as it were. So as I see it, in capitalism and under particular capitalist conditions, from my sort of, Marxist point of view, the problem is that none of these advantages, even when they're sort of set in law, are actually there to stay, because the political economy makes a big difference, and so that shapes how we understand citizenship. And in my other work, which has been mostly actually just on citizenship, I have tried to precisely show this, to say, look, citizenship, there have been moments in the history of liberal countries, in the kind of consolidation of democratic institutions, where citizenship played a progressive role. But this is right now not the case anymore. So citizenship has become, from being a vehicle of inclusion, it has been actually a vehicle of disenfranchisement and marginalization. So if you think, for example, about how citizenship is now used to exclude particular categories of migrants, and this goes back to one of the previous questions, which is maybe that the category of migrant is too broad, and one should point out more specifically which migrants we're talking about and under what socioeconomic conditions we understand their migrant status and so on. But it seems to me that right now, the trend when it comes to citizenship understanding in many liberal democratic countries is to use citizenship as a vehicle of disenfranchisement and exclusion. So think about the way in which, for example, citizenship gets combined with ethnicity, and which requires people to take nationality tests and things like that. So to test national belonging. This did not used to be the case. Citizenship, if you just take it as a legal category, I think I'm with you, I agree with you, it can be potentially inclusive if democracy goes well, if all goes well in a particular institutional environment. But my worry is that because of these pressures, these global political economic pressures, that cannot be and cannot remain the case. And that how we understand this process of political mobilization makes a difference to then what tools do we have to respond to these changes.
Yeah, thank you, Bernd. Thank you, Lea. We have 3 more questions now. So if you'd like to be included in the Q&A, it would be good if you signaled that in the next couple of minutes. Now, the next participant in discussion is Andreas Oldenburg, who will appear shortly. Here he is. Hello, Andreas. Can you unmute your microphone?
Sorry. Now, thank you, Peter. Thank you, Lea, for this wonderful talk. I have very much sympathies for this class perspective as well, but I have my worries too. I put a similar point a bit differently, I think. You took a very cooperative perspective on the question on the role of states and on political communities. But of course, you can also take a power perspective on the role of the state. And in that case, we would have a very basic power structure of state borders that are a result of colonialism and decolonization afterwards. I mean, I don't have to explain this to you as you worked on that stuff yourself. And I think this wide-ranging power history leads then to a basic difference, whether you can live kind of a decent life as a worker or not. You can do that in states like ours, but you can't in states south of the Sahara. And therefore there is, I think, a deeper conflict with actually still overlapping cleavages, and a full power analysis would have to take account of that.
Thanks, Andreas. Lea?
Yeah, thank you, Andreas. I think I'm actually very sympathetic to that. And I even had a section in a paper in which I try and develop that a little bit more, and I didn't have time to present it. But I think I agree with you. And in fact, I would go even further. I would say that being aware of how that colonial history and how that history of exploitation, accumulation in different parts of the world has actually shaped the development of liberal institutions is actually very important also to the self-understanding of progressive movements within these countries, within advanced liberal democracies, because I think often the narrative is one where you say, you know, well, a little bit like I was saying earlier, where you think that the welfare state is the product of this kind of great conquest of the working classes that mobilized and somehow managed to defeat their rulers and managed to defeat their bosses and so on. And I think they often forget that these things were against the background and enabled by this history of accumulation and commercial, taking commercial advantages and being in a kind of dominant power perspective. So sometimes we forget, even when we tell the history of, you know, the development of the working class, advantages and legal rights and so on, the inclusion of disenfranchised groups in liberal democracies, we often forget that the condition for having these advantages was precisely exploiting people in other parts of the world, was taking advantage of their vulnerability, was often being able to, you know, send in your companies with your contracts who can then make a profit, and therefore they can also then afford to pay more taxes within advanced capitalist societies and so on. And I think sometimes when we tell the story of the labor movement domestically, we forget about that. We just see it as the result of a kind of struggle and mobilization that was successful, and we forget that those mobilizations were in part successful because the states could afford to make these concessions, because they were able to develop and to exploit in other parts of the world. And this is obviously familiar from all the, you know, traditional Marxist critiques of imperialism or whatever, from, I don't know, Hobson to
Thank you.
I think so. But I think that's also worth, I think you're right, it's bearing in mind and bringing it out.
Thank you, Lea, for this response. Now we're waiting for Svenja Alhaus to log in with the next question. Hello, Svenja.
Hi, Lea, good to see you. Thank you for your talk. I have a question regarding Rainer Bauberg's suggestion to speak of a progressive trilemma and not a dilemma. So he said that we shouldn't use this duality, but speak of openness, a trade-off between openness to immigration, multicultural inclusion, and social redistribution. I was wondering how that would complicate the picture you're painting, because as others have suggested now, what seems to miss a bit in your talk is the idea of democracy. And I mean, we could also speak of a second progressive dilemma that is very popular, or maybe it's only pseudo-progressive, a very popular dilemma at the moment: support for immigration versus support for democracy. So the more immigration, the more we might include people who do not support democracy. And I was wondering whether if your critique could also take this idea of a progressive trilemma, or how you would incorporate this triadic structure in your critique. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I think I'm not. I'm not that familiar with the with Bauberg's analysis, so I only have sort of vague knowledge of it. But I think I am familiar. I think I'm sympathetic to this idea of integrating the distributive concern with the cultural concern, and then with thinking about historical developments of democracy. I mean, I think he's got quite a kind of almost like a neo-Gramscian analysis of how this, how democracy develops and how it's mobilized then to advantage particular groups within these societies and so on. So I think I'm broadly speaking supportive. I guess I would emphasize more the importance of thinking about class and what this global understanding of class does to the understanding of seeing this kind of evolution, democratic process in responding to this, to the trilemma. But I'm not being very specific because I'm not aware of the specificities of his argument. So I'm just relying on what you were telling me now. And it sounds as though it is compatible.
Thank you.
So the next question comes from Erwin Conductio, and Erwin has also written it in the Q&A format, F&R in German. Lea, can you read this? Can you just have a look? Because Erwin has this rather long quote. Ah, no, it's now disappeared. That's a shame.
Yeah, I think I can see it now.
Oh, can you see, even though he agrees, he's going to ask this in person. He is online now, but because there's this Marx quote, which is very characteristic, I would like to ask you to read it too. Yeah. Erwin, the floor is yours.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes, hello, do you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes?
Yeah.
I need to find the, hello, I need to find the quote again, to be honest, but
is it this one about the proletariat must settle matters?
Yes, exactly. It's towards the end of the first chapter of the Communist Manifesto. So my question had to do with, let's say, sociological presuppositions for operationalizing your understanding of this class-based solidarity. So the idea is that, okay, it's not as self-evident as the quote might suggest to me, but it seems to me that it does reflect this idea that shared experience is somehow necessary for political action, for operationalizing political struggles. And I was wondering, how do you envisage this in the level of praxis in the level of political struggles.
Yeah, great.
Because it seems to me, very briefly, I mean, I agree in principle with your thesis, but it seems to me that the solidarity that refugees and migrants are enjoying the last 10, 15 years does not come from the lowest, let's say, classes, the less well off, but it's more a middle class thing. Maybe it's a speculation. I don't know how true this is, but yes, that was my question. Thank you.
Yeah, I think just on the last, I mean, a sort of throwaway remark on the last one, I would say that's actually also the problem, as I see, the fact that the solidarity they enjoy comes from the sort of the elites rather than the people who are within the sort of shared condition of oppression, at least as I see it. But I think there is a difference between the Marxist position that you have put on the box with regard to, you know, solidarity, and the one, that kind of liberal egalitarian position with which I started, because I'm tempted to agree that it's a matter of pragmatic adjudication and, you know, thinking about strategic priorities and where you're going to focus on your struggle when you choose, you know, I'm going to focus on this territorially bounded community because this is where the institutions are, this is where elections are, this is what, you know, this is where I might be able to make more of a difference. But I think the claim is not, that I started with, is not that claim. The claim is different. It's when we have a nation state of the kind that, you know, is built around this process of social cooperation and inclusion and so on, then we have bigger obligations of social justice to fellow cooperators within this membership unit than we have to outsiders. And that is a kind of normative prioritizing that is very different from the strategic prioritizing that Marx was talking about, and which I think is much more problematic because that really narrows down the scope of action, because it says, well, whoever is outside my boundaries, I don't worry about, you know, they have migration for different reasons. I have to take responsibility of my fellow citizens. I have to share, I have to extend, you know, justice to my fellow citizens and so on. So these are very different perspectives. I think they may sometimes lead to the same conclusions, but how you theorize that condition, how you theorize a predicament, I think matters hugely, because it can be limiting of further action, or it can be opening up of further action depending on changed political circumstances. And my worry is that having that kind of theory that has prioritized this level of analysis, which is, you know, we have political membership and we have to take responsibility for our, has ended up reifying a particular historical condition, which was, you know, the emergence of social democracy making gains, extending advantages, and so on. It has reified it. It has then reified it in theory. And now, because we have that kind of theory, we are unable to deal with the changed political circumstances and with the changed empirical conditions that require us to go back to a different normative framework that is more global and which thinks about oppression along global lines.
Yeah, thanks for this reply. There's right now no further question either in the FNA nor in the list of hands. So I take the liberty of asking two very small questions myself. The first is, I mean, why choose a Marxian notion of class here? Wouldn't you be better off with the older utilitarian, classical utilitarian notion of class? Because already Bentham and James Mill thought that class is structured along the lines of the ruling few and the subject many, and all those who are oppressed form a class. And I mean, this is what you have in mind, basically, especially, and that's the second point, if you don't aim at re-establishing a notion of a cooperative society, but stay content with the notion of a conflictual society. I mean, frankly, I think there's no hope beyond cooperation in political theory. And even those who have a conflictual view of society at least aim at, normatively speaking, at introducing cooperative relations. So I don't see the liberal Marxist divide where you see it in cooperation versus conflict, but the liberals believe that cooperation is exploitative and should be transformed into just relations. And the Marxists believe that cooperation is exploitative and should be transformed into just relations. So I'm really uneasy with this wedge you drive between cooperation and conflict understandings of society and of solidarity, because it seems to be a joint interest in liberal and Marxist accounts to aim at just cooperation in a society. I mean, where else would you want to go if not towards a cooperative society with this model of solidarity?
Yeah, great, thank you. Okay, so about the first one, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if there were parallels between Marx and the utilitarians on this, because obviously Marx, I think, was in many ways influenced by people like, you know, James Mill and also Bentham, and Adam Smith obviously is really important. So I think there is a sense in which there may be quite a lot of similarity. What the utilitarians don't have, which Marx obviously gives, is the analysis of capitalism also as an empirically grounded analysis, and the, you know, the explanation of why this particular society emerges at this particular point in time, why it makes these assumptions and so on. So, but yeah, it's possible that obviously there is a lot in Marx that I think he shares with the utilitarians and with that tradition as much as he shares with, you know, the Hegelian, the kind of German tradition. I think he's definitely also coming from that tradition, especially when he talks about political economy, and especially when he talks about these questions that I have been tackling. So let me just clarify something about cooperation and conflict. I wasn't hailing conflict as a model for the future. I'm only saying what assumptions you make about the political unit in which you live makes a big difference. And so it's not that the Marxists are saying, you know, let's have conflict rather than cooperation. It's more that they're saying, let's expand the unit on which we think about where does cooperation matters and who do you cooperate with. So in the Marxist, or in the kind of class-based model of solidarity, the cooperation of workers across the world matters hugely, right? So it's not a question of abstract distinction between do we like cooperation or do we like conflict. It's a question of who cooperates with whom where. And so my critique is that in the liberal political egalitarian, the sort of liberal egalitarian framework, we restrict the unit of cooperation to the nation state, which we idealize along certain lines. And we are therefore failing and creating these conflicts with other people outside of that unit, which are hugely damaging and hugely problematic for both. So I'm not saying that, you know, they have cooperation and I have conflict and I like conflict better. What I'm saying is that their understanding of amongst whom does cooperation apply and who do we exclude is actually very dangerous, because it's not able to account for the types of conflicts that we face, for the types of solutions that we need to envisage, and so on. But yeah, thanks for asking me to clarify.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. So we still have a couple more minutes left. So if anybody has a spontaneous quick question. So it seems that you have resolved all the major paradoxes.
I thought so, yep.
Yeah, so very successful hour here in virtual Dresden.
Great.
Okay. So instead of going on about utilitarianism, I would like to thank Lea very much for this inspiring presentation and for shaking up the discussion just a little bit, because although you insist that it's not a totally materialist conception that you are introducing, I think we didn't have this kind of influence too much in the conference, in the papers that were preceding it. So it's a very welcome contribution to bring a bit of international political economy